Welcome to Higher Education for Human Flourishing. This webinar is part of the Virtues and Vocations Initiative, a forum of higher education trying to understand how to integrate character, purpose, and meaning into pre-professional and professional education. It is funded by the Kern Family Foundation. My name is Suzanne Shanahan, and I am host of this initiative housed at the Center for Social Concerns at the University of Notre Dame. This is our final webinar of the semester, and we are delighted to have with us Dr. Nii Addy. He is the Albert E. Kent Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Associate Professor of Cellular and Molecular Physiology at Yale, and the inaugural Director of Scientist Diversity and Inclusion at Yale School of Medicine. Nii is also director of the Faculty Mentoring Program, Minority Organization for Recruitment and Expansion, and co-chair of Career Development Subcommittee of the Anti-Racism Task Force in the Yale Department of Psychiatry. He contributes to graduate student and postdoctoral training and to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives through his efforts on campus and in scientific societies. Nii received his BS in biology from Duke University and his PhD in neuroscience from Yale. Dr. Addy's lab investigates the brain processes underlying depression, anxiety, and substance use disorders. He and his team also investigate new potential therapies for mental health challenges. In addition to his campus work, he hosts the Addy Hour podcast, discussing topics at the intersection of neuroscience, mental health, faith, culture, and social justice. He also serves on the board of trustees for the Carver Project, aimed at empowering and connecting individuals from across university, church, and society. Welcome, Nii.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Great to have you. So if you're game, I'm hoping we can have a fairly open-ended conversation exploring questions of mental health and flourishing, but also exploring how you got into this work personally and professionally, and where you see it going from here. Seem reasonable?
That sounds great to me.
Great. So I did want to note that questions are going to come in through the Q&A mechanism. We'll open up to those questions at about 12:40. So we can talk for about 40 minutes and then see where we land.
Yeah.
Great. So I understand at some point in your undergraduate career, you were deciding between biology and psychology. Can you talk a little bit about where that interest came from in the first place? Why was that the choice?
Yeah, wonderful question. I'll go all the way back to my childhood. So both of my parents were born and raised in Accra, Ghana. They actually met in medical school, and my dad is a psychiatrist. So I've shared this story in other places before, but growing up, I always told my dad that I didn't want to do anything related to what he does. Obviously, I was not very successful at that, but that was my initial lack of motivation, if you want to call it. But at the same time, I did have a lot of exposure to the work that he did. So he's also a sleep physician. So he was getting involved in that profession when it was really starting to take off. He'd often take me into the lab and show me some of the things they were doing. He would hook me up to electrodes sometimes, and I get to watch, EEG brain waves on the screen. That's not something that everybody gets to do, but I think that had an impact on me early on. So I always had that interest when I got to college and things around psychology. I was also interested in biology. But as you alluded to, I was stuck in trying to decide between the two of those. I actually had a psychology professor who suggested that I not be a psychology major, but a biology major. I always tell people that was a little bit offensive to me at the time because I felt like, I guess I'm not cut out for this major. But I think he also just saw the innate drive and passion and interest I had in biological questions and was trying to help me steer in that direction. So I was really fortunate to be able to get some research experience through summer research programs, also working in a lab during my junior year on campus, a lab of Dr. Ed Levin, someone I still keep in touch with. And so for me, it was a mixture of having that professor kind of see where I was heading and give me a little bit of a push and guidance in that direction, but also having really great research experience that kind of solidified those two together.
Great. So as you probably know, lots and lots of Duke students go on to medical school. Why did you pursue neuroscience?
So for me, neuroscience was something that I was really interested in, partially from my lab experience, but then also from my coursework. So that same abnormal psychology class I was taking, we also had the opportunity to actually volunteer at a regional mental health hospital in North Carolina. And so I was there once a week with other students, interacting with patients and just seeing what a lot of the folks in that organization were doing, just meeting people on the ground. But I was also getting involved in research as well. So in my lab, we were actually looking at the effects of nicotine on working memory and seeing how nicotine actually impacts memory in those who might be taking antipsychotics. So for me, it was a really intriguing question to be thinking about that at the time. A lot of statistics have shown that about 80 to 90% of people who are living with schizophrenia actually smoke cigarettes as well. So there are all these hypotheses about why that might be, whether the nicotine was helping people as a way of self-medication, whether it was alleviating some of the cognitive deficits that are associated with the illness, but also associated with some of the medications. And so that was really my first foray into research. And it was an interest that really stuck for me as I was able to investigate that. But then also as my mentor sent me to conferences. So I actually went to a conference as an undergrad at Duke and presented some of the research we were doing in our lab to a room full of scientists, which was completely overwhelming and intimidating, but also kind of facilitated that love for scientific inquiry early on.
Great. What do your parents think of this choice? Sort of, your father had the last word a bit?
So I think multiple things. They were very encouraging about it along the way. I think it was also maybe a little bit comical for them to see me kind of come back full circle, to be completely honest. But I think for them, I would say it was also very gratifying. In a lot of ways, they're both individuals who highly prize and value education, especially immigrating to the U.S. and knowing all the opportunities that were here for us in the States, for me and my younger siblings, and to see me take full advantage of that, especially since at a younger age, that was not my motivation. I used to always tell them that as long as I was doing better than someone else in the class, I was completely satisfied, which I think did not sit well with them, especially if I got a C or a D on an assignment and someone else did worse. I know that was difficult for them to really try and force me to pull through. There was a series of things that happened that helped me facilitate that internal motivation. So I'm sure if you ask them, there would be a mixture of both pride and maybe relief at the fact that I eventually kind of settled in. But they've been really encouraging and supportive all along the way.
That's great. Was there something you talk about, sort of this internal motivation and how you came to the study of neuroscience? Was there a particular moment at which you thought, this is it for me? This is really where I want to go and where my passion lies?
I think it actually grew gradually over time. So you actually allude to the fact that a lot of people in science will go towards medical school. And that was something I was wrestling with at the end of undergrad. So I actually took 2 years off between finishing undergrad and going to grad school because I was trying to figure out, do I want to go the MD route? Do I want to go the PhD route? Do I want to do an MD PhD route? So I was really fortunate, again, to continue working in Dr. Levin's lab, but then also to have a lot of great mentors that I could meet with. So my academic mentors were still there at Duke, Dr. Singer in particular, who would just give advice and kind of help me navigate through some of those questions. But as I continued to get experience, as I worked in some clinics over the summer, I could really feel my research passion and drive. Part of that was I realized how much I didn't know, especially when it came to neuroscience. That really motivated me to actually go back to graduate school and learn more about the research. And as I got invested in different projects, it was that same piece of just realizing how much I didn't know, but also having mentoring from people who also showed me not just the importance of doing the science, but also impacting the next generation, students and trainees. So for me, it was a combination of the scientific interest, but then also being able to mentor, teach, and educate within a laboratory setting, within the classroom, and as my work has continued just in society in general.
That's great. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of research you're currently doing?
Yes, definitely. So in the lab, we have 3 main areas of focus. We're looking basically at the brain biology of what happens in different states, with a particular focus on addiction, depression, and anxiety. And basically what we're doing at a really kind of 30,000 foot level is really trying to understand the brain biology that allows us to engage in complex behaviors as human beings. And then we're looking at specific behaviors that are associated with those 3 illnesses that I talked about, either addiction, depression, or anxiety. So we're basically trying to understand what's happening in the brain so we can get a better understanding, not just of those behaviors. So you might think of craving and relapse when it comes to addiction, or people who might have a lack of motivation or an anxious response in certain situations, trying to understand what's happening in the brain that allows those things to emerge. And then also seeing if we can actually get a better understanding of what may be causing the illnesses, but then also to try and identify potential novel therapeutic targets. So right now we're actually working with some brain proteins in the brain that are targeted by antihypertensive medications. These are known as L-type calcium channels. And it turns out that these channels are also implicated in neuropsychiatric illnesses. So if we can see how these channels might actually allow these behaviors to emerge, we can potentially target therapies that will target those channels to decrease anxiety, decrease craving and relapse, and perhaps have antidepressant-like effects. So that's, in a nutshell, kind of some of the work that we're doing. I will also say we're also looking at the impact of flavors on nicotine use. As you all may know, there are myriads of flavors that are available in e-cigarettes, probably upwards to 10,000 at this point. And it's been a mixed conversation of whether that's actually letting younger people facilitate into nicotine use early on, or helping older individuals who are trying to quit smoking combustible cigarettes to get to something that could potentially be less harmful. That's also a bigger conversation, but that's kind of the nature of that piece. And so we've been looking at how those flavors actually impact things like nicotine taking behavior and nicotine relapse behavior and other components associated with nicotine addiction as well.
So what is it you like most about the kind of research you do? Like, where in your day are you happiest with your research?
Yeah, so I would say that has actually shifted over time as well, because as you can imagine, with the number of hats that I wear on the moment, I'm not in the lab doing the work as much as I was early on, but still just to have that initial piece about learning some new aspect of understanding that we didn't understand before. So some of the work that we do in particular, a lot of the work we do is basic biology. We're looking at behaviors in rodents and rats and mice, as people may know. And then we can also use tools to actually see what's happening in the brain in real time, which is pretty amazing. So to be able to see a change in a brain neurotransmitter, dopamine is one that we look at in particular. A lot of people may have heard of dopamine. It's been the focus of movies. People have talked about things like dopamine fasting. We can come back to that if you want, but it's also important for pleasure and craving. And so to be able to see changes in dopamine concentrations in the brain in real time while an animal is engaged in the behavior is pretty fascinating. And then to be able to understand that we can actually potentially decrease that dopamine response and decrease craving is pretty powerful as well. And to know that can also have implications on human behavior, we try to translate that into clinical studies. For me, that's always really exciting. And just being, I'll call myself a science nerd or science geek, but seeing data hot off the press, as it were, and having some new insight into something that we haven't known before is still a pretty remarkable thing to be able to do. Not that that happens every day, but it happens frequently enough that really keeps us going.
That's great. So you talked about the many hats that you wear. You also talked about the importance of mentoring. So can you talk a little bit about how you think about mentoring and the kind of mentoring work you do, but then also perhaps talk about the DEI work you're doing?
Mm-hmm. So mentoring is something that's been really important to me, as you mentioned, and part of that is because I've really benefited from a lot of great mentoring over the years. Going all the way back to my undergraduate advisor, Dr. Levin, also including my graduate advisor, Dr. Marino Picciotto. And I also was able to just participate in a lot of different programs over the years and have informal mentoring from other scientists, but also people in the community. So for me, it's always been important to really tailor that mentoring to the individual that I'm mentoring. So my approach is not to have a one size fits all kind of mentoring approach, but to really have one with good open communication. So I'll give you one scenario just in terms of the individuals in my lab. I have undergraduate students who work in the lab. I also have graduate students. I have individuals who've already obtained their PhDs and are doing their postdoctoral training. And I have research scientists. And so each person is at a different place. And then even within any of those specific categories, if you like, people are also at a different place. Some people are coming in with a lot of research experience. Some may have less. So at the beginning, we also always try to have just really straightforward conversations about expectations. So I talk about my style as a mentor. I ask them about their preferred style as a mentee, just to make sure we're on the same page, because one of us might be hands-on, the other person might be hands-off. We may both be very well-intentioned, but just be missing each other completely. And I've seen that happen so many times when people have good intentions, but just don't have that initial conversation to see whether they match or not. Also, it just takes into account different backgrounds that we have. They may have a different cultural background than me. We can talk about cultural or family expectations and how that actually impacts our mentoring relationship as well. And I often just like to check in and just see how people are doing on a day-to-day basis. That's my mental health advocacy hat that comes in as well. But knowing that can also impact our relationship and how we navigate through it together. So I guess in the broad sense, I really try and think about it as a holistic approach, and then also not pretending that I know everything about mentoring or that I know everything about them, but that we're both learning together. And it's something where we both equally have to contribute to the relationship. Not equally in terms of every component that we bring, but equally in terms of our investment and our willingness to be open to learn and adjust to each other throughout that relationship.
So as you talk about mentoring, I'm thinking of two things. One, sort of, you had good exemplars, right? Sort of as you were an undergraduate, graduate school, and thinking about mentoring. Where do you learn to be a good mentor, number one? And are there particular mentoring sort of traps, problems people tend to run into when you think about mentoring in general? Because I don't know that it's something people naturally know how to do well.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because sometimes in a lot of academic circles, sometimes people have the expectation that they're either good mentors or they're not good mentors and don't necessarily have that growth mindset about learning how to be a good mentor. Or you have some unfortunate situations where people think they're wonderful mentors. You talk to their mentees, you might get a little bit of a different response and reaction. So there needs to be a little bit of an openness there as well. In terms of a learning, I think there are ways that people can learn that informally, from learning from others, having good examples, also from learning from poor examples and say, okay, I'm going to make sure that I avoid doing this or try to avoid doing this when I'm a mentor, because I can tell that doesn't work. But there are also a lot of good resources that are available as well. In particular, the University of Wisconsin, there's a national mentoring network there. The Dr. Christine Fund has been directing for a while, that particularly focuses on mentoring in academic spaces, particularly for the biomedical sciences. But there are also tools in different places. So a lot of organizations have mentoring tools. With some of the mentoring programs I started here at Yale early on, we actually used some of the mentorship tools that were provided by the US government they had used in-house. So it was really helpful to have those conversations, because there are definitely best practices that people can incorporate and learn. There are people who are doing research around mentoring. A lot of teaching and learning centers will also have access for faculty members who want to develop and improve their mentoring as well. And I know there are publications that have started to focus on this as well. My wife also does a lot of work in this realm, not just on mentoring, but on faculty development in particular, in her role as a teaching and learning center director. And so there are lots of resources that people can avail themselves to, graduate students. I know I'm not giving a lot of specifics here, but I'm basically saying that there are a lot of tools that people can actually tap into to learn what those best practices are, to learn about the evidence-based practices, and ways, again, that people can improve. And I see the link is in there as well, which is wonderful. So I appreciate whoever is staying on top of that and providing those links. That's wonderful.
Can you describe a situation where in your own mentoring, it was very challenging for you in some way, and how you addressed it?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few that come to mind. I guess I'll go to maybe the easiest one, and that's just with everything that we navigated through with the pandemic, and how difficult it was for a lot of those of us who are mentoring, but also those who are being mentored, and just knowing how to navigate through that, because there was so much uncertainty, so much anxiety a lot of people were going through, and we really just had to be able to iterate and change expectations. So I think that was a challenge, as some people were trying to keep the same pre-COVID expectations in the middle of COVID, which wasn't working, but somehow it was difficult to let go of those. I mean, there's so many situations where I'd see students or trainees having really high expectations, not being able to meet those expectations, feeling frustrated and meet those expectations, and then trying harder to meet those same expectations and trying harder to meet. So basically just getting stuck in a loop without being able to, or being willing to adjust or readjust. So I think for a lot of us as mentors, we were also facing that as well. And so as both sides were struggling and navigating together, sometimes it was difficult to be able to meet people where they were, to say, okay, maybe we need to let go of what the expectations were. Maybe we may need to be able to redefine those expectations. But at the same time, as a mentor, you don't want to remove those completely. So you still have some goals you have to move through. So I think it was a combination of challenge, just with the emotional weight that a lot of mentees were going through, trying to navigate through that, trying to navigate through the work expectations. And again, it just had to be for me a conversation with each individual person, whether that's in my lab, whether that's with faculty that I mentor, to be able to take a step back and just talk about how we were navigating, feeling in the moment, and to continue to iterate and readjust. So I'd say that challenge in particular just required a lot of readjustment, resetting expectations, and taking time to be patient with each other, especially with everything that was going on around social justice. Those things weren't new, but it was affecting so many of us in different ways that we also had to be cognizant of that. And I had to be more aware of things that might be affecting my mentees in different ways that might be affecting me or not affecting me. So I know I didn't give you one clear example,
Oh,
but I
no,
kind of
that's
threw
great.
them all together to give just
Yep,
some highlight points about some of the principles that came out as well.
that's great. Can you talk a little bit about your DEI work and sort of what your goals are there, what you're up to?
Mhm. Yeah, so I'll talk about my current DEI role, but I'll also put it in context just to give listeners a sense of some of the things I've done over the years. So I've been really fortunate to be able to be involved in diversity, equity, inclusion work at different levels throughout my career. Some of that has been informal. So as a grad student, you can decide whether you would throw this into that category or not, but just tutoring students in the local community here in New Haven and giving some students access to things at Yale that they might not normally have access to. As I've been here on campus, I've worked with a lot of undergraduates. I also worked with our graduate students. We have a group known as the Collective, which before was the Yale Minority Research Science Network, where basically students of color would get together once a month, graduate students and postdocs, and have invited faculty to come and share about their journeys and their stories, which is really important because for many of those students, they didn't see a lot of people that looked like them. They weren't sure if they could succeed in a place like that. So to have touch points with people of lived experience, I think was really helpful. I was able to serve as an informal mentor in a lot of those sessions and to be able to facilitate some of those conversations, which is really gratifying. I've also been involved in some of the work with our postdoctoral fellows, again, just making sure that we have access to people from lots of different backgrounds and lived experiences so they can also be involved in opportunities here on campus. I've done some mentoring in scientific societies. A few years ago, we had a really big initiative at Yale called the Belonging at Yale Initiative that cut across the entire university. So I was fortunate to be able to participate in that working group. And again, it gave me eyes for some of the things that we've been thinking about on campus and how that affects the entire campus community. And then most recently, sorry for the sirens in the background, but most recently I've been involved working in the Dean's office at Yale School of Medicine, specifically with a role that's called Director of Scientific Diversity and Inclusion, as you mentioned. And that really has been focused on our underrepresented faculty and researchers here on campus. So really making sure that this is a place where they can thrive. So part of what we've done is just focus on having a time of belonging. So time for people to kind of get together, talk about their experiences, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well. Then also to focus on mentoring. And not to say that people aren't getting mentoring in their current situations, but sometimes it's helpful to have additional mentoring, again, that ties into people's lived experiences of what it's like to be an underrepresented faculty on the School of Medicine campus, especially with the challenges and the benefits that come with that. I mean, there have been microaggressions that have happened, side eyes, questioning, wondering, do you belong here, do you not? And those things can add up and really take a toll on individuals. So to have a space to talk about those things and to have specific mentoring around that has been important. And also just to create leadership opportunities, both in terms of professional development and leadership training and support, but then also to make sure that when leadership decisions are being made, that those in this cohort also have their names included in that they're at the table and they have these opportunities. So it's really been a gratifying venture to jump into. It's slow work in terms of building that community, but I've heard a lot of feedback from the faculty that they really appreciate just the time to be in space with other individuals like them as they kind of go out into their home departments and in their workplace and continue the work that they're doing, which is also impactful and important.
Great. So you're clearly working within a context nationally where DEI is being rolled back in a number of universities. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about that rollback, but how that also affects what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, that's really, really important question. And so I think it's something that a lot of us are continuing to pay attention to and just to be aware of in the work that we're doing. One of the organizations that you mentioned early on that I'm involved in is the Minority Organization for Attention and Expansion. And again, that group was started specifically because there were a lot of faculty of color who were leaving the university because they had reached a ceiling in a sense, and there weren't as many opportunities as there should have been here for those individuals. So started officially in 2007, but really started informally in 1958 by Dr. James Comore and Dr. Jim Patton, two individuals who were two of the first African-American faculty members here at the Yale School of Medicine who just mentored people informally. So we know that those things are important in terms of making sure that it's a place that's inclusive to people from all various backgrounds, but we're also just trying to pay attention to the changing landscape. And so I don't have a clear answer in terms of what is the best way to do that. But again, part of it is just having open, honest, and frank conversations as people are concerned about things that are happening, so that people can think about how to navigate in their day-to-day lives as faculty members, but also to think about ways they continue to get that support and ways they can use wisdom in terms of the types of decisions that they make to still make sure that these important topics don't go to the wayside. So in a lot of ways, it's similar to the mental health work that I do, not in terms of the nature of it, but in terms of the importance of having the conversation, the community, and the support, where we can all really think strategically and intentionally about how do we keep these important principles and practices moving forward.
One of the things I think is interesting about your work, and you've mentioned this a couple of times, is sort of the impact it has outside of the medical school and this notion of social justice and impact. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about your work within the medical school and how it affects the world outside the medical school?
Yeah, a really important topic. And as you can probably hear in my comments, that's also something that's been a passion of mine for quite a while. So again, even as I was a graduate student, tutoring kids in local community. So for me, I've always tried to be very intentional about not getting stuck in the Yale bubble. Not to say that we don't have that's not a good thing, but also it's not the entire world. And so it's been important for me to just continue to interact with the broader community, and also to be able to use the knowledge that we can gain in a space like that to really be able to communicate and to be able to promote the societal good in a sense. And so I've been fortunate to really see that happen in a lot of ways since I've been here as a faculty member. I've been involved with the Veritas Forum organization. So again, that's focused on college campuses, but a group that's really intentional about having conversations on college campuses with people from a background of faith, and maybe people who are coming from a lack of a specific faith practice, but to think about how that actually implicates aspects of our vocations and our day-to-day lives. So that's been a wonderful organization to be involved in. But I've also just been able to continue to see that build in a lot of ways. So back in 2018, we had a town hall conversation here on Yale's campus with Lecrae, who is a hip hop artist that people may be familiar with, also a New York Times bestselling author. And he came to campus. We invited him in partnership with the Yale chaplain's office, and also with our vice president for student life. I really had a conversation about the intersection of neuroscience, mental health, faith, culture, and social justice. And so really did our homework in a sense to kind of get a sense of the pulse on campus. I was also working with the pastor of the Black Church at Yale. And to hear students come to that event and say that was the most transformative event that they had been at since they had been on campus was really powerful to hear. And to see a cross section of campus show up to that, undergraduate students, graduate and professional students, administrators, people from the local community, was really powerful. And so we've been able to actually replicate that in lots of different ways. We did a similar event to that in 2019 in New York City with lots of guests. And then again, had people showing up to that saying, I've been waiting 20 years for this conversation. So again, to see how much there was a hunger for those things has been really important. I know at least for me in an academic circle, in academic environments, really easy to become myopic and focused on what we're doing on campus and forgetting how impactful some of these things might be in the broader community. That's not to say that every scientific experiment that we do has to have direct impact in the community, but for me, it's been really helpful to see how much people have really embraced the work and how much people want to just know what we're doing on campus, what are the latest findings in neuroscience and things like that. So just to be able to have those open conversations has continued. And that's something that I've continued to see over the years as I've spoken in different circles, as I've given occasional sermons in churches, trying to integrate aspects of neuroscience, mental health, and faith. And just to see the hunger and the need there, I guess it's a cycle that continues to facilitate and reverberate in that sense, because as I continue to see the need and the hunger, just gives me that much more motivation to continue to partner with others to bring this information to a broader audience.
Great, thanks for that. Can we talk a little bit about science and faith? In a variety of locations, I've heard you describe yourself as a man of faith.
Mhm.
Um, it- what does that mean to you, both sort of in your day-to-day life, but also in your neuroscience work, your scholarship, your professorship at Yale, your DEI work, et cetera?
Mhm. It's a great question. I'm smiling because I've been fortunate to have this conversation a few times over the last couple of weeks, which again speaks to, I think, just the need and the interest in having these conversations. One was for a class last week with some of our MD PhD students here at Yale. The week before that was with a group of leaders in New York City at a men's Christian men's gathering in the morning. And these conversations always come up, and I think it's really helpful to see how people are continuing to think about that and wrestle with that. For me, in terms of my faith tradition, that's something that I think really grew for me throughout my high school years, especially as I was involved in just outreach work and seeing people that had a deep faith and calling in their lives, where it was really their relationship with God and not trying to follow the rules. So that's something that, as I started to see that in others, became more apparent to me as well. And so it's really facilitated everything that I do in terms of my foundation and my perspective. Not just my perspective in terms of studying the science. I often tell people that I feel like I'm studying God's creation as a neuroscientist and be able to see that. But it also impacts my interactions with others and my perspective in terms of things that people may have gone through in their own lives, their experiences, and really being able to just listen and kind of meet people where they're at. A lot of times early on, especially when I was a trainee, I would hear a lot of scientific and intellectual oppositions to faith, and trying to have open dialogues around those things, but then often realize that as I built relationships with people, a lot of times, even though those conversations were usually framed in terms of an intellectual opposition, they were usually things that people have gone through in their lives that actually had facilitated that. So people would eventually talk about a loss or a challenge and feel like they had issues with God if God would allow that to happen. So just to be able to be empathetic and to actually have dialogues with folks has been really important. And so for me, it's really kind of impacted my perspective in that way as well. But I've also just seen lots of opportunities that I feel like God has opened up to be able to have honest conversations with people. And then to be able to hear people tell me repeatedly, oh, I'm so glad that you're talking about faith on your podcast or in your, in your scientific endeavors and as you're navigating through communities. And these are coming from people who have a faith background or people who would identify as atheists. So I think in a sense, it has also become important, even in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'll share one story with you. I went to give a talk in Oklahoma, I think about 2 months ago at a research institute out there. And I had done a podcast episode with one of my colleagues here on campus, a psychiatrist, talking about the integration of faith and mental health. So before I landed, they actually watched that entire hour-long YouTube video before I got there, and the whole conversation was about this aspect of faith and science. And so from their perspective, they, I think, appropriately identified that the faith component hadn't really been talked about much in scientific circles, and in a sense that there's a limitation when we think about really being inclusive of people from different backgrounds, especially since so many people in this country have a faith background, and often in scientific and certain academic institutions or departments, it's easier to push that to the side. So this group was saying, we're actually going to elevate that and make sure that this is a realistic and important conversation, which caught me off guard. It probably shouldn't at this point because it keeps happening, but each time, for some reason, I still feel surprised. So again, just to give you some practical ways that I've seen that happen over the last few years.
That's great. When you think about faith and science, is it faith and science, or are faith and science more integrated in your thinking? Like how do they come together in that confluence?
Yeah, I think about them in a very integrated way. I actually thought you were going to, because a lot of people would also ask me, is it faith and science, or is it faith or science?
Yeah.
I've talked to a lot of students who have had that experience and have felt like they've had to choose between the two. For me, I do agree. I do think it's faith and science. And I also think that they are asking different questions. So even one of the things I shared with the MD PhD students last week, when I think about the science itself, I feel like in our scientific endeavors, we're trying to identify the hows, especially when we're doing the neuroscience, we're trying to look for specific mechanisms. That's a word that we often use in the field. What are the mechanisms that underlie this specific behavior or substance use disorders or anxiety disorders? What are the mechanisms that allow that to occur in the first place? What mechanisms can we actually change to bring it to a different outcome? And so there's a lot of how questions that we're trying to discern, but that doesn't always tell us the why. Now, when it comes to mental health, there are lots of things that can contribute to the why. There are experiences that people have had that can impact their brains, their traumas, their positive spiritual, positive negative experiences, their cultural race and racism. All those things start to get at the why, but it doesn't get at the ultimate why of why are we here in the first place. And so when I think about faith, that to me is answering that question of the why and the purpose and those types of things. But there's still an aspect of faith to it. One thing I've joked about, there have been studies that have shown, activation in certain parts of the brain when people are doing spiritual practices or when people have a sense of God's presence. I always say that you can interpret that one of two ways. If you're someone who is a pessimist or says, doesn't believe in a higher power, you could say, well, see, this is the region of our brain or the regions of our brain that let us believe that God exists, but it's just because of brain activity. Or you could say that that's how God designed us to be able to sense his presence and to be engaged in these spiritual practices. So ultimately, that still comes down to a question of faith. Grant, I know that's a little outside of the question that you asked, but that's something that I always think about in terms of both the faith and science and how I approach things.
Do you think of your work in neuroscience as a calling?
I do. And I would say even more so, I think about not just within the neuroscience, but just the calling that I have in my life in general. And that's one component that allows me to facilitate that calling.
What's the broader calling, do you think, in your life when you think about what you're called to do?
Yeah, and that's changed over time. I would say at this specific point in time, it's really to be able to inform and educate based on the knowledge and experience and training that I have in whatever shape or form that might be. So two practical examples, sometimes in the faith community, it can be actually educating and bringing understanding about what I've learned within neuroscience and why that's important to incorporate. There's still too many instances where I hear people saying that they've been told they aren't getting better in terms of their mental illness because they aren't prayed hard enough. And so there, I feel that frustration rise within me, which I've heard a pastor talk about. The things that get you upset are the things that you're passionate about. So in that sense, I'm really able to kind of facilitate and interject in that time conversation, not to say that I have all the answers, but to engage in dialogue, at least bring some of the understanding from neuroscience. On the scientific side, I feel like I've also been able to do that in terms of bringing in the reality of the power of faith and what that means in people's lives. When I've heard people make dismissive comments about, oh, what are we supposed to do with people who think the higher power can help them navigate through their addiction? And so to also point to the evidence about the power of being in community and the power of being in the faith community and how that can also impact. But then just in so many different other circumstances, I even think just about, one-on-one conversations that I have with people. We've had people on the podcast, we've talked about burnout for some reason. At that same time, I was getting a vaccine and the CVS pharmacist was complaining about how it was such a toxic and difficult place to work and all the challenges. And so being able to step in that moment and say, this is someone who is sharing a need for whatever reason, feels comfortable kind of opening up, and what can I do in this moment to actually have an impact and be supportive and be encouraging? That happens in family, that happens in faith community. So I try and think about that on a day-to-day basis. Obviously, that's not always easy to do. I'm a person just like everybody else. So I have my moments where I'm tired or frustrated or running low on fumes. But I'd say in terms of my general calling, that's something that I really feel passionate about. And just paying attention to where my frustrations are and why God may be guiding me in those frustrations to actually speak into certain situations.
Does it surprise you that you think of your vocation in those terms? Like if you think back to your time when you're anticipating going into neuroscience, this is a pretty broad understanding of yourself and your contributions to the world. Does that surprise you? Or did you kind of have a sense this is where you were headed all along?
No, it definitely surprises me. I think if you told me what I'd be doing now 20 years ago, I probably would have laughed because I don't think I had that vision. Granted, some of the passion probably was there in the latent form, but I don't think I could have articulated what that would actually look like down the road, especially early on, because to be completely honest, it was just overwhelming just thinking about the neuroscience itself and trying to really get a handle on that and really understand it. So I think part of that has developed over time. But also just being able to engage with so many people in the community and seeing how much of an impact and how many questions people have. And I think that's just the reality of mental health in general. Whenever I tell people what I do for a living, it automatically starts a conversation because people either have gone through something themselves or they know someone who has navigated through mental health challenges. We've all had emotional challenges at the very least. And so it really sparks a lot of conversation in people. So I feel fortunate to be able to be in a profession in a space where I'm able to kind of contribute to those conversations, but I don't think I would have predicted it in any sense. Also because I tend to be someone who likes to hide in the background. So the fact that the podcast logo has my face as a cartoon image is not something I would have predicted or even selected initially, but I was, given some good advice on why that was important. I'll also say, again, going back to the mentoring piece and the sponsorship piece, just really having investment of other people and partnership with other people who've been able to facilitate that. So specifically, as we've worked with a lot of high profile individuals, I just wanted to stay in the background and have them kind of share their story and do the whole thing. The thing about that is they were all looking to me to lead the thing that I had asked them to do. So obviously that's not going to work if I'm just going to kind of sit in the background. So it took time for me to really own that and step into that space and to say, okay, this is something that God has given me a passion for. There are people who are willing to partner with me in it, but I still need to lead it and step into it. And so once I was able to shift into that mindset, I think that also opened up a lot of these doors. But for that reason, I definitely would not have predicted it or even probably wanted it.
So this is graduation season, high school, college. I'm here in DC and my daughter just graduated from Georgetown.
Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. What advice do you have to give to young people who are starting on a pathway, to think about sort of your own pathway and the pursuit of a sense of vocation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one thing I would say, it will sound trite, but it's not. And one is just to pay attention. So to actually pay attention to what really drives you and where your passions are, and to not dismiss that because you feel like you have another expectation that you technically are supposed to actually hit or supposed to fulfill. I mean, that's not to say that you should ignore those things. If you have a passion for something that doesn't seem feasible, you might have to think creatively about how to get to that, but to really pay attention to what those passions are. And then just to be able to also think creatively about ways to either be engaged in those passions, maybe as you're doing something else from a practical standpoint, or ways to move forward towards that in a bigger sense. The second thing I would say is actually similar, but more in the mental health realm of just paying attention to kind of how you're navigating on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I think if anything the pandemic has done, it's allowed many of us to just pay more attention to our emotional rhythms throughout the day and not just to barrel through without taking time to pause and say, okay, why is this thing really making me feel unsettled? Or why do I feel uncomfortable in this situation? Or why do I feel really riled up and frustrated by the situation? And to be able to kind of evaluate that and to use that to move forward, either in conversation with other people or just taking a step back and saying, okay, things that affect me emotionally are probably going to affect how I operate on a day-to-day basis. We don't have to pretend those things aren't there. We can acknowledge that and actually move through more effectively. And we can also get help if we need to. So not to be afraid to avail yourself to help if it's needed.
Great. So I want to turn to some of the questions that are queuing up here. Mm-hmm. So the first one says, in the past year, there were 7 suicides in our local college campus. Do you have any advice or guidance to give about mental health challenges we are seeing amongst undergraduates?
Yeah, that's a really important point. And it's always disheartening to hear about those situations that come up. So I definitely commiserate with that as well. But I think it's important to be able to pay attention to that. And so one of the things that a lot of us in the mental health advocacy field have talked about, as psychologists in particular, is just the importance of being able to talk to others. So one of the challenges on campuses is that there is such a long wait list for actually getting behavioral services, which is a challenge and a problem. But at the same time, there are also opportunities for many of us just to be there and to be able to listen and to provide support if we notice people struggling in certain ways. So especially if there are changes like in someone's overall mood or in their motivation that lasts for a long time, it's good just to be able to be there and to be able to listen. And oftentimes, when we say listen, many of us have a hard time actually listening because especially if we see something like that, we want to try and fix it right away. So we think we're listening to somebody, but we're actually just letting them say a little bit and then we're just giving them our solutions for how to fix the situation. So it really does take effort to kind of sit back intentionally and listen to what people are going through. And then just to make yourself available if someone actually needs help and to kind of facilitate that, not to push it on them, but to facilitate that. The other piece I'll bring up in terms of the challenge of suicide is one of the myths that a lot of people don't actually realize is a myth. And that's the idea that if you ever mention suicide to somebody or you notice something where they seem to have suicidal thoughts, or they say they don't want to be around anymore, that somehow if you bring that up to them, you're planting that idea in their head. All the research suggests exactly the exact opposite. So just the fact that you bring it up lets the person know that they're seen, and it's more likely they'll actually be able to get help. So, I mean, it's easy to understand why a lot of us wouldn't want to do that, because we feel like we're doing something wrong, or we're placing this in their heads, or we're going to make the situation worse, when it actually is the opposite. So I always like to mention that, just to encourage people, if they notice that, to be willing to be able to bring that up in a loving way, obviously. But that can really be really important and life-saving for people as well.
So a related question to this, it seems as if mental health challenges are increasing on college campuses. Is that just an impression? Is that accurate? And what might attribute that?
Yeah, so I think there are two things that are happening there. One, it has been increasing, but then also people are paying more attention to it as well. And so there is a little bit of people just being able to realize that those things are there, those challenges are there, and paying more attention to it and actually trying to address them as well. So I think it's a really important point. I did notice another question that came up in the chat, so I sidetracked momentarily, but even hearing a comment of someone saying that they're in that space of misery right now. So I just want to acknowledge that that comment came through, and then also just to encourage, that person in that specific situation to be able to reach out and talk to others. It's obviously that's easier said than done, but it's so important, because a lot of times, which others may not realize, but when people get to that point, part of it is just people feel like there's no escape from the misery, and so someone is you can feel stuck in a place of just pain and trying to figure out how to get out of that pain. So again, it's so important to be able to talk to someone. So again, whoever put that in the chat, really encourage you to reach out, even to any of the folks who are facilitating the session, just to be able to have a touch point and a way to kind of navigate through, because that's not an easy place to be.
Great, thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned your podcast, and one of the questions is about particular favorite guests and conversations you've gotten to have, because you really have had some amazing individuals on. Can you talk a little bit about if there's a favorite, if you're willing to say?
That's always a really hard question, because there have been so many good conversations. I don't know if I have one favorite in particular. I have some favorites, so I'll go that direction. I would say before I answer that, just the range has been really nice to see, because, we've had political pundits who've been on the podcast. We had Lecrae come back and be paired with a neuroscientist. I also had a theater company in New York City that contacted me. And so we did a conversation with the cast and crew of a play that was about Cambodian refugees and what they went through when they came to the States here. So it's really been dynamic in that sense. I would say, it's funny, I always try and think ahead of time, which one would I pick as a favorite? And I can never quite do it. What would I say? I say one of the early ones I really enjoyed was with Doug Middleton, who was a former NFL player with Dr. Alfie Breland Noble, who started the Acoa Project and really focuses on Black and Indigenous people of color, particularly youth. And just to see the dynamic between them, as they have both been doing work around suicide prevention, but people that hadn't been in the same space before, and just to see almost the joy and excitement and passion that each of them had for each other's work, and the way they were really able to have a dynamic conversation. So many overlapping topics was really touching to see in real time. The other one, this is more on a humorous note, I did also interview my dad, as I talked about early on. It was a sleep physician, and we had a conversation about sleep and mental health, and just all the stories that he shared of his interactions with patients over the last 40 years, and how much really concrete advice he's been able to give people, and the way he was able to kind of capture that within the stories, I think was really telling. And it was also funny for me to be able to interview him on screen during COVID and see all the mannerisms I picked up from him that I didn't realize, even though I'm in my 40s. You'd think I would realize that by now. So that was also a treat in a lot of ways. And then another one, I'll pick one more. So just people being really flexible. I also had a conversation with Esther too and Jeremy Lin while he was playing in China. One, for him to kind of make the time in his schedule to jump on the podcast, but also just all the things that he shared about his COVID experience in China, being in isolation for 77 days with some of the COVID protocols, for him to be really vulnerable about that. And just also to share about the work he's been doing in his foundation and so many practical stories about how so many of us are navigating through different emotional challenges without realizing who others that we might have known for a while who may be navigating through those same challenges. So again, just a dynamic conversation, and to have Dr. Chu there as well, kind of sharing from her experience, both of them growing up as Asian Americans in the US. There's so many layers to that conversation. So I'll stick with 3. That was hard to do.
That's good. Don't want to pick just one, so that's great. So next question, you discussed a bit about the relationship between faith and mental health. I was curious whether you more often see faith in a support for strong mental health, or whether faith communities discourage people from getting the help they actually need.
Yeah, really good question. Hard to quantify, but I've definitely seen both. So from my perspective, obviously, I'm probably more on the side of where I've seen it be helpful, because if I was in a space where I saw it as hurtful, I probably want to interject in that, but I probably wouldn't be, unless I felt called to navigate in that space for a very long period of time, just out of frustration. But I do know that those things definitely exist. So I think there's been more of an openness to that. But I do know that a lot of people have gone through difficult situations in church settings that have actually caused mental health challenges, especially if it's someone else in the church, or they've had a mental health challenge that they feel like has not been helped by the interactions that they've had in church settings. People are being dismissive of it, or telling them that they should just pray harder, or that they shouldn't see a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist or social worker. Sometimes, unfortunately, I think that's people's own internal frustration coming out. Again, it goes back to that aspect of, are we actually listening to people, or are we just trying to fix it? And so someone might just be trying to fix it without really paying attention to all the other tools that we can actually use to navigate through our mental health challenges. And it's, for me, it's gratifying to see so many mental health practitioners in church settings who are having those conversations and trying to facilitate those things. So yeah, I definitely agree it can go both ways, but it's really encouraging to see when those things actually go together. And so that episode I referenced before was with Dr. Charles D.K., who is a psychiatrist at Yale, also a person of faith, who talked about the effectiveness of combining, for instance, psychotherapy with spiritual practices. And so for me, those have been the most powerful, to really see those conversations continue to come to light and to see people taking advantage of that.
Great. Are you seeing, just a related question, are you still seeing sort of cultural differences in the acceptance of conversations around mental health, seeking mental health intervention, those sorts of things? Or is it much more prevalent now?
Yeah, so I think people are more open to it overall, but those differences still exist. And so depending on not just cultural, but place of the country, and people's background and experiences, some people coming from households where you're told, we don't talk about what happens in this house, stays in this house, we don't share our business with other people. There are so many layers to that, because some of those are due to mistrust with the medical system, and some of that very justifiable. If we go back, 80 years or less in this country, some of the atrocities that have happened in terms of Tuskegee trials or a whole host of other things. So it takes time to be able to walk through those. So I don't, have the statistics or data in particular, but that has also been there. I think also another piece of it sometimes is just an aspect of what a lot of psychologists will call cultural competency, and making sure that when someone goes to see someone, that people are aware of their cultural, and I'll add also faith background, and not just assuming that this specific way that I approach things is something I'm just going to put on top of you, as if you're the exact same person as me and that's going to work for you as well. So that's something that people have to be really aware of, knowing just the impact that someone's life experience has had, knowing the impact that broader societal things have had. One example I sometimes share is a study that David Williams did at Harvard in the middle of the pandemic, just showing the effects on communities when there was an unarmed Black person that was killed at the hands of police, and how that negatively affected the mental health of people of color in that state after the event occurred, whereas it didn't negatively affect others. So if someone from that community came to see you as a practitioner, you should be aware of the fact that this might be impacting them, If you are oblivious to that and you treat it as if nothing had occurred or why are they feeling this way, you would miss the whole point. So that's just one practical piece, one small story, but one practical way where that cultural competency can really play an important role. Similarly with faith background, you need to know the language of people's faith to know where they're coming from. You can't just dismiss a whole aspect of someone's identity.
Great. Next question. Can you talk a little bit more about the differences, including advantages, disadvantages, in thinking in terms of mental illness versus mental health versus mental healing or human flourishing? And for each of these, seeing them through a focus on the individual versus understanding individual versus social contexts.
Yeah.
So that's a big one.
That is a big question. I'll see if I can break it down. So I'll start by saying that mental wellness broadly is something that we should all focus on, just in terms of how we navigate on a day-to-day basis. The other thing that I'll say that I've shared elsewhere is that it's possible to be living with a mental illness and still have good mental wellness. So that was actually something that I thought about more so in my conversation with Sean Astin, an actor that many people may know. He's also the son of Patty Duke. So she had bipolar. It wasn't called bipolar at the time, but one of the things that he shared is it was often difficult for her to hear people just saying that she's struggling, she's struggling, she's struggling. You're someone who struggles. You can have a mental illness and still have good practices in place and actually navigate through that pretty well. There may be challenges on certain days, but I think that's an important thing to consider. At the same time, you might not have a mental illness, but you could have pretty poor mental wellness. So let's say you don't have a mental illness, but you are going 1,000 miles an hour, you're sleep deprived, you're irritable, you're not effective in your work. I mean, all those different components. If you never take a time to pause, you might not have any diagnosed mental illness, but you might not be in a good place in terms of your day-to-day cadence. So I think it's important to acknowledge that as well. To the question, I would say the ultimate goal for all of us is flourishing, regardless of whether mental illness is part of that or not. And so it's important to acknowledge that and to know that we can still navigate through those things, even if we have a mental illness. But there are challenges that will come. So some people might have a moderate mental illness, maybe struggling with something like anxiety, depression. Not to say that that's small or easy. That's also different from maybe a severe mental illness like schizophrenia. And so it's also important to know that there are different layers and different levels to it as well. And so, yes, I think it's important to both distinguish, but then also realize some of the commonality that runs across those things. Because again, for a lot of us, it's really thinking about things on the spectrum. And that's something the National Alliance of Mental Illness talks about a lot, especially if we think about anxiety. All of us will experience some level of anxiety at some point in our lives. For some, that may gravitate towards an anxiety disorder, something that's really debilitating. For others, it may be minor at times, and then it may swing between those for any of us at any particular point in time. So I think that also helps to put things in a big picture perspective. So that was a big question. So I tried to cover a lot in a short period of
time. So just as a final thought, right, lots of folks heading off into summer. And in fact, I read my horoscope this morning, which said I should focus in the next month on mental wellness. Any tips for the audience as we think about mental wellness over the sunny months?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say actually goes back to some of the same advice for those who've graduated is just to take time and actually pay attention. So one of the terms that people sometimes use in the field is metacognition, and basically that's thinking about your thinking. And so, I mean, it's a fancy way to say it, but basically just to take that time to pause. And that's not to say emotions are bad, but we should also pay attention to why we have emotions at certain times. And we might not be able to do that in the moment, but sometimes it can be good to reflect back on that after the fact and say, okay, why did I feel or react that way? And be able even to predict or anticipate when that feeling might come up again. So maybe there's certain people that you're around that make you feel uncomfortable, anxious, or frustrated. As much as you can kind of get in front of that and plan for it, we engage, the prefrontal cortex, the front area of our brain that's actually important for emotional regulation. And so those types of things can actually help us navigate through those situations. The second thing I would say is just take time to pause. Even if it's the summer, and pausing may look different at different times. You might be relaxing with people. Maybe you just need to take a pause and step away from them for a little bit to kind of reset. Or maybe you're doing a lot of work and you haven't stepped outside in 9 hours and you should take a 5-minute walk around the block. Those things can be really important for resetting our brains in a lot of ways and giving us space and time to kind of navigate through. So one, practice some metacognition to think about your thinking and take times to pause as well.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you. This has been such a treat to get to talk to you. I really appreciate it. And thanks to all those who joined us today, and look forward to seeing y'all next fall. So have a great
Great to be
summer.
here. Thanks so much. You too.